On the morning of November 23, 1932, a thin winter sun rose over the Ukrainian village of Havrylivka in the Kharkiv region. Frost clung to the wooden fences, and smoke no longer curled from many chimneys. Inside a small clay house, a farmer named Mykola Shevchenko sat quietly at his table, counting the last handful of grain left in a cracked ceramic bowl. Outside, the land that once fed Europe lay silent. Just weeks earlier, on August 7, 1932, a decree signed in Moscow, later known as the Law of 5 Years of Grain, had sealed the fate of millions. Ordered by Joseph Stalin and enforced by officials like Lazar Kaganovich and Vyacheslav Molotov, it turned hunger into a crime. In Kiev, notices were posted. In Kharkiv, checkpoints blocked the roads. In the Kremlin, reports were read and approved. By December 1932, Ukraine was locked from the inside. No war had been declared. No enemy had crossed its borders. And yet, in villages like Havrylivka, death was already walking from house to house, quietly, patiently, leaving no sound behind except the slow fading of human breath. Before the silence broke, 1928 to 1931. In the early hours of April 12, 1928, dawn arrived gently over the Ukrainian countryside. In villages scattered across the fertile plains of Poltava, Cherkasy, and Kharkiv, farmers rose with the sun, as they had for generations. The black soil, Chernozem, among the richest in the world, lay ready beneath their feet. Wheat fields stretched to the horizon, and Ukraine still carried its old name in Europe's memory, the breadbasket of the continent. In a small village near Mirorod, a farmer named Ivan Hrutsenko harnessed his horse and walked toward his field. His life was modest but ordered by the seasons: spring sowing, summer growth, autumn harvest. The revolution of 1917 and the civil war that followed had passed like storms, leaving scars but also hope. By the late 1920s, many Ukrainian peasants believed the worst was behind them. Far away in Moscow, the mood was different. On December 27, 1927, during the 15th Congress of the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin consolidated his power. By 1928, he was no longer merely one leader among many, he was the center. From his office in the Kremlin, Stalin saw agriculture not as a way of life, but as a lever of control. The Soviet Union needed rapid industrialization, and industry needed grain to feed workers, and grain to export for hard currency. Ukraine stood at the heart of that calculation. In January 1928, Stalin approved the first emergency grain requisitions. At first, they were presented as temporary measures. Officials traveled to Ukrainian regions like Sumy and Vinnytsia, demanding surplus grain. The word surplus sounded harmless, but farmers knew better. After bad harvests and years of war, there was no surplus, only what kept families alive. Still, most complied. Resistance came quietly. Grain hidden beneath floors, wheat buried in sealed pits. These were not acts of rebellion, only acts of survival. By November 1929, Stalin announced what he called the Great Turn. Private farming would end. Agriculture would be reorganized into collective farms, kolkhozes, owned by the state. The announcement, published in Pravda on November 7, 1929, reached Ukraine like a cold wind. In villages near Kiev, party representatives held meetings in schoolhouses and barns. They spoke of equality and progress. They promised tractors and prosperity. But behind their words stood armed members of the OGPU, the Soviet secret police. Signing up for collectivization was called voluntary. Refusing was remembered. Those who hesitated were labeled kulaks, a term that once meant wealthy farmer, but now meant anyone the state chose. On January 30th, 1930, the Politburo issued a resolution calling for the liquidation of kulaks as a class. Within weeks, families across Kharkiv Oblast were dragged from their homes. Livestock was seized. Homes were sealed. Trains carried deportees east, toward Siberia and Central Asia. Stalin briefly blamed excesses by local officials in an article dated March 2, 1930, titled, "Dizzy with Success." Some hoped this meant relief, but it was only a pause. By late 1930, collectivization resumed, faster, harsher, more complete. In Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, reports piled up. Grain deliveries lagged behind Moscow's expectations. Party leaders grew anxious. Stalin grew suspicious. To him, Ukraine was not just underperforming, it was disloyal. On August 19, 1931, Lazar Kaganovich, one of Stalin's most trusted allies, was assigned to oversee Ukrainian grain procurement. He traveled through administrative centers, meeting officials behind closed doors. His instructions were precise. Quotas were non-negotiable. By the end of 1931, more than 65% of Ukrainian farms had been collectivized. The traditional rhythm of rural life was broken. Horses were gone. Tools were shared or missing. Farmers worked fields that no longer felt like theirs, knowing that most of what they grew would be taken. Winter settled over Ukraine in December 1931. In villages near Zhytomyr, bread grew scarce. In Kiev, queues lengthened. Yet trains continued to depart, carrying Ukrainian grain north and east. No one called it a famine. No one announced a crisis. Life continued, quietly tightening like a knot. On the surface, the fields still waited for spring. But beneath the snow, something had changed. The soil was the same. The people were the same. Only the rules had shifted, and those rules were written far away, by men who would never walk these fields. The silence had not yet broken, but it was already listening. The order from above, 1931 to 1932, by the spring of 1931, the fate of Soviet Ukraine was no longer shaped in its villages, but in offices far away, behind heavy doors and polished desks in Moscow. From the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin watched the countryside through columns of numbers, grain targets, quotas, delivery reports. To him, Ukraine was not a land of families and fields. It was a resource, and it was falling short. On January 5, 1931, the Politburo of the Communist Party reaffirmed its commitment to full agricultural collectivization. The policy was clear. Private farms would disappear, replaced by state-controlled collectives known as kolkhozes. In theory, this was meant to modernize agriculture. In reality, it marked the beginning of a systematic assault on the Ukrainian peasantry. Across regions like Poltava, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv, officials arrived with documents stamped and signed. They were often escorted by members of the OGPU, the Soviet secret police. Farmers were ordered to surrender their land, livestock, and tools. Resistance, whether spoken aloud or quietly practiced, was labeled sabotage. Those who resisted were given a name, kulaks. It was a vague word, deliberately so, A kulak could be a wealthy landowner or simply a farmer who owned 2 cows instead of 1. By February 1931, thousands of Ukrainian families had been declared kulaks and forcibly deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Many never returned. In Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, reports flowed in daily. Grain deliveries were lower than expected. Stalin responded not with concern, but suspicion. In letters dated June 1931, he warned that Ukraine was becoming a nest of nationalist deviation and that failure to meet quotas was political betrayal. To enforce discipline, Stalin sent trusted men. Lazar Kaganovich, a close ally, arrived in Ukraine in July 1931. He traveled through major administrative centers, holding meetings with local party leaders. His message was calm, but absolute. Quotas must be met, no matter the cost. Alongside him was Vyacheslav Molotov, chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Together, they approved grain procurement plans that ignored weather conditions, poor harvests, and human limits. The numbers were set in Moscow. Ukraine was expected to deliver more grain in 1932 than it had produced. By the autumn of 1931, the pressure intensified. In villages near Sumy and Vinnytsia, grain brigades were formed. These were groups of local activists, often young and ideologically driven, tasked with searching homes. They checked barns, cellars, even stoves. Any hidden grain was confiscated in the name of the state. Winter came early that year. On December 14, 1931, a new directive tightened control over Ukrainian villages. Collective farms that failed to meet quotas were punished. Supplies were cut. Trade was restricted. The message was unmistakable. Obedience would be rewarded, hunger would not. In January 1932, Stalin personally intervened again. Writing to Kaganovich, he accused Ukrainian officials of weakness and demanded harsher measures. Soon after, the grain quotas for Ukraine were increased. It was an impossible demand placed on an exhausted land. By March 1932, hunger had already begun to show its face. In villages outside Kiev, bread portions were reduced. In Kharkiv, workers fainted in factories. Still, trains loaded with Ukrainian grain rolled eastward, bound for Russian cities and export ports. The final blow came on August 7, 1932. From Moscow, the Soviet government issued a law officially titled "On the Protection of Socialist Property." It became known among the people as the Law of 5 Ears of Grain. Under this decree, taking even a handful of grain from the fields, grain that once belonged to the farmers themselves, was punishable by 10 years in prison or execution. The law was enforced without mercy. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, children were arrested for picking up fallen wheat. In Poltava, entire families were sentenced for hiding food. The courts worked quickly. Compassion was considered counter-revolutionary. By October 1932, Stalin sent Molotov back to Ukraine with extraordinary powers. Villages were placed on blacklists, officially cut off from food supplies and trade. Roads were blocked. Markets closed. Ukraine was being sealed from within. No announcement was made to the world. No declaration of emergency. There was only paperwork, signatures, and silence. In the calm offices of the Kremlin, reports were reviewed and approved. On the frozen soil of Ukraine, the consequences were already unfolding. The order had been given, and once given, it would not be withdrawn. When hunger entered the villages, 1932, by the early summer of 1932, the Ukrainian countryside was still green, but something unseen had already begun to move through it. The wheat grew thinner than usual, the stalks shorter, the ears lighter. In villages across Poltava, Kiev Oblast, and Kharkiv, farmers noticed the change and spoke of it quietly, often at night when no one else was listening. On June 6, 1932, a report reached Moscow stating that Ukraine's grain deliveries were again falling behind schedule. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin read the figures without alarm. Poor harvests, he believed, were excuses. Failure was sabotage. Hunger, in his mind, was discipline. In Kharkiv, still the capital of Soviet Ukraine, local officials gathered in party offices under portraits of Lenin and Stalin. Orders arrived demanding immediate action. Grain quotas would not be revised. Instead, enforcement would be intensified. Villages that failed to comply would be punished. That summer, grain procurement brigades returned, this time more organized, more ruthless. Composed of party activists, local officials, and armed men from the OGPU, they moved from village to village. In Lubny, in the Poltava region, they arrived at dawn on July 18, 1932. Homes were searched methodically. Floors were pried open. Walls were tapped for hollow sounds. Even seed grain meant for the next planting was seized. For farmers like Ivan Hertsenko, whose family had already surrendered most of their harvest, there was nothing left to give. Still, the brigades wrote reports stating that grain had been concealed. The language of paperwork turned absence into guilt. On July 25, 1932, Vyacheslav Molotov chaired a meeting in Moscow approving additional measures for Ukraine. These measures were administrative in name, but lethal in effect. Villages that failed to meet quotas would lose access to goods. Shops would close. Trade would stop. Hunger would do what persuasion could not. By August 1932, the first signs of starvation appeared. In villages near Bila Tserkva, children grew unusually quiet. Women traded clothing for food that no longer existed. Men walked long distances to neighboring regions, hoping to barter or beg. Many returned empty-handed. The law that sealed their fate arrived on August 7, 1932, officially titled On the Protection of Socialist Property. It became known as the Law of 5 Ears of Grain. Signed in Moscow and enforced immediately, it criminalized even the smallest act of survival. Picking up fallen grain from a field could result in 10 years in a labor camp or death. In Chernihiv Oblast, a 12-year-old boy was arrested on August 21, 1932, for gathering wheat kernels after harvest. His sentence was recorded, approved, and filed. There was no appeal. The law was doing its work. As summer turned to autumn, the pressure tightened. On September 1, 1932, Lazar Kaganovich arrived in Ukraine once more. He traveled between Kiev and Kharkiv, holding closed-door meetings with party officials. His tone was calm, almost patient, but his message was absolute. Ukraine would fulfill its obligations, or Ukraine would be punished. By October 1932, entire villages were placed on blacklists. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, blacklisted villages were surrounded by checkpoints. Food deliveries stopped. Markets were shut down. Goods were confiscated. Notices were posted warning residents that leaving the village without permission was forbidden. Hunger now had borders. On October 27, 1932, a directive ordered intensified searches. Homes were re-entered, sometimes 3 or 4 times. Pots were emptied. Bread was broken apart to check for hidden grain. In villages near Sumy, people began boiling grass and tree bark. Some survived on beet leaves and straw. The first deaths were quiet. An elderly woman found lifeless on a bench. A child who did not wake up. These were recorded as natural causes. No mention of hunger appeared in official documents. In November 1932, winter arrived early. Snow fell over fields that had been stripped bare. In Kiev, hospitals began receiving patients suffering from severe malnutrition. Doctors were warned not to use the word famine. To do so was counter-revolutionary. On November 18, 1932, Stalin approved new internal passport regulations. Peasants were denied passports, effectively trapping them in their villages. Trains leaving Ukraine were guarded. Roads were watched. Hunger could not escape. By the end of 1932, Ukraine was sealed. Grain continued to leave. People could not. In villages like Havrylivka, where chimneys no longer smoked, families gathered at night in silence. There were no prayers spoken aloud. Words required energy, and energy was gone. The famine had not yet reached its peak, but it had crossed the threshold. Hunger was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and it was staying. Hunger as a weapon, 1932 to 1933. By December 1932, winter had tightened its grip on Ukraine. Snow covered the empty fields, hiding the scars left by repeated searches. In villages across Kharkiv Oblast, Poltava, and Kiev Oblast, doors stayed shut, not for warmth but for fear. Hunger was no longer a consequence of policy. It had become the policy itself. On December 14, 1932, a joint decree from Moscow ordered the complete enforcement of grain procurements in Ukraine. Signed under the authority of Joseph Stalin and approved by the Politburo, it demanded absolute compliance. Any remaining food, grain, potatoes, dried vegetables, was to be confiscated. Even seed reserves were no longer protected. In Kharkiv, officials compiled lists of non-compliant villages. These blacklists were more than administrative tools. Once a village was blacklisted, it ceased to exist economically. On December 18, 1932, the village of Verbivka in the Dnipropetrovsk region was surrounded by checkpoints. Trade was banned. Deliveries were stopped. Armed guards ensured that no food entered, and no one left. The roads froze. So did hope. At the same time, Vyacheslav Molotov was dispatched again to Ukraine, this time with extraordinary powers. He arrived in Kharkiv in late December 1932, holding nightly meetings with regional leaders. His instructions were measured, almost bureaucratic. He spoke of discipline, of responsibility, of fulfilling the plan. Hunger, he implied, was a failure of loyalty. On January 1, 1933, a new year began without celebration. In villages near Bila Tserkva, church bells were silent. There was nothing to mark the passing of time except the slow weakening of bodies. Bread rations had long since vanished. Families survived on boiled water, mixed with whatever could still be found: straw, bark, frozen weeds. That same month, Stalin approved further restrictions on movement. On January 22, 1933, a secret directive ordered the sealing of Ukraine's borders. Peasants attempting to flee to Russia or Belarus were to be stopped and returned. Thousands were detained at railway stations in Kharkiv, Kiev, and Poltava. Many collapsed on platforms before they could be sent back. In the Kremlin, reports described this as success. Fewer refugees meant improved order. By February 1933, death had become routine. In villages across Chernihiv Oblast, bodies were discovered in homes, on roadsides, near wells. There were no funerals. Coffins required wood, and wood required strength. Often, the dead were wrapped in cloth and placed in shallow graves once the ground softened. Hospitals in Kiev overflowed. Doctors documented cases of severe starvation, swollen limbs, blindness, total exhaustion. They were instructed not to record famine as a cause of death. Officially, people died of weakness or illness. The truth remained unspoken. Children suffered most. On February 12, 1933, an internal report from Kharkiv described orphan children wandering the streets, too weak to beg. Many were collected and placed in overcrowded shelters, where food was scarce and disease spread quickly. Survival was uncertain. By March 1933, Ukraine had entered the famine's darkest phase. In rural areas of Poltava and Sumy, instances of cannibalism were recorded by the OGPU. These reports were marked secret and filed away. The state acknowledged the horror only to conceal it. Meanwhile, grain exports continued. Trains loaded with Ukrainian wheat departed daily, bound for ports on the Black Sea and for industrial centers across the Soviet Union. In Odessa, ships sailed while villages inland starved. The contrast was stark, but invisible to the outside world. Foreign journalists in Moscow were shown model collective farms and well-stocked stores. Walter Duranty of the New York Times wrote on March 31, 1933, that there was no actual starvation. His words traveled farther than the cries of the dying. In April 1933, as the snow melted, the scale of the catastrophe became impossible to hide, yet it remained officially unnamed. Fields lay empty, not from lack of seed alone, but from lack of people. Entire families had vanished. Entire villages had fallen silent. In the countryside near Mirorod, farmer Ivan Hrtsenko's house stood abandoned. Neighbors later recalled that the family disappeared one by one. No records marked their passing. Hunger leaves few documents. By May 1933, deaths reached their peak. In some regions, thousands died each day. The famine had achieved what force alone could not. Resistance was gone. So was speech. So was strength. In the calm offices of the Kremlin, the plan was declared fulfilled. Ukraine had been broken, not by drought, not by war, but by deliberate design. Hunger had been shaped, directed, and enforced. It had become a weapon, wielded quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. And as spring returned to the land, millions were no longer there to see it. The world that looked away, 1933. By the early spring of 1933, Ukraine was dying in plain sight, yet the world beyond its borders saw almost nothing. The famine had reached its peak, but it existed in silence, buried beneath censorship, fear, and carefully managed lies. In Moscow, foreign journalists lived under constant supervision. Their movements were monitored, their sources controlled. Travel permits to Ukraine were denied or delayed indefinitely. On February 23, 1933, the Soviet government issued new press regulations requiring all reports on food shortages to be approved in advance. Hunger, like dissent, was not to be named. One journalist stood at the center of this silence, Walter Duranty, the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times. On March 31, 1933, Duranty published an article stating that there was no actual starvation in the Soviet Union, only widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition. The distinction mattered little to the dead, but it mattered greatly to governments abroad. Duranty was widely trusted. He had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1932. His words reassured the West. Not all journalists agreed. In late March 1933, a young Welsh reporter named Gareth Jones defied Soviet restrictions. Traveling secretly by train, he entered Ukraine without official permission. He walked through villages near Kharkiv and Bila Tserkva, speaking to peasants who whispered of hunger and death. On March 29, 1933, Jones issued a statement in Berlin, declaring plainly, "I walked through villages where people were dying of starvation." His account was accurate and quickly discredited. Duranty publicly dismissed Jones's claims, calling them exaggerated. Soviet officials labeled Jones a liar. Western diplomats, eager to maintain relations with the Soviet Union, chose caution over confrontation. The truth, though spoken, was drowned out. Meanwhile, the famine continued unchecked. By April 1933, villages across Poltava, Chernihiv, and Sumy had lost a third or more of their population. In some areas, there were no adults left to bury the dead. Mass graves appeared on the outskirts of villages, dug hastily once the frozen ground softened. In Kiev, hospitals remained overcrowded. Doctors worked in exhaustion, treating bodies that could no longer heal. Internal reports described extreme starvation, but these documents never left government archives. To acknowledge famine was to admit failure, and failure was treason. Inside Ukraine, speaking of hunger was dangerous. On April 7, 1933, several teachers in Kharkiv Oblast were arrested for discussing famine conditions with students. Silence was enforced not only through fear, but through habit. People stopped asking questions. They stopped telling stories. Survival required forgetting. In May 1933, the Soviet government quietly adjusted its policies. Grain requisitions were reduced. Some limited food aid was distributed to collective farms, but only after quotas had been met, and only to those deemed politically loyal. For many, the relief came too late. On June 7, 1933, Stanislav Kozhier, first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, reported to Stalin that the grain plan had been fulfilled. The message was clear. The objective had been achieved. Ukraine had been subdued. Deaths continued into the summer, but the worst had passed. Not because the people were saved, but because there were fewer left to starve. Beyond Soviet borders, governments chose restraint. The United States formally recognized the Soviet Union on November 16, 1933. Trade agreements followed. Diplomatic relations mattered more than distant suffering. Ukraine's famine was not mentioned. In private letters, some diplomats expressed concern. In public, there was silence. By late 1933, fields were sown again. New workers arrived, orphans, relocated families, laborers from other regions. Life resumed in a broken form. The land remained fertile. The people had changed. No memorials were built. No mourning was permitted. The famine was erased from textbooks, from newspapers, from public memory. Parents did not tell their children. Children grew up without words for what had happened. The world moved on. The famine had killed millions, but it left something else behind, a deeper wound. Not just the loss of life, but the loss of truth. A tragedy unspoken becomes a shadow, stretching across generations. Ukraine survived, but it did so carrying a silence heavier than hunger. And that silence would last for decades, waiting patiently for the moment when it could finally be broken. The scars that remain, 1933 and beyond. By the summer of 1933, the land of Ukraine had begun to awaken again, as the snow melted and the rivers carried the spring thaw through villages like Havrylivka, Bila Tserkva, and Poltava. On the surface, life seemed to return. Fields were plowed. Seeds were planted. Trains carried grain, as they always had, along tracks to Moscow and beyond. Yet beneath the soil and in the hearts of the people, a deeper wound remained, one that no spring rains could heal. In June 1933, Joseph Stalin received reports from Stanislav Kozhier, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine. The grain quotas had been fulfilled. Officially, the mission was complete. The famine had done its work. Villages that had resisted collectivization were broken. The countryside was subdued. Moscow called it success. But in reality, Ukraine bore the invisible weight of millions of lost lives. By historical estimates, between 30 and 70 million people had suffered, with approximately 3 to 5 million deaths directly attributed to starvation. Villages like Verbivka and Mirorod were empty or nearly so. Homes stood silent, roofs sagging, chimneys cold. Graves were shallow, unmarked, often forgotten. The survivors carried both memory and trauma. Parents who had lost children became cautious, whispering names in secret. Children who had witnessed death grew silent, afraid that speaking might summon further loss. In Kiev, schools and hospitals struggled to reopen. Teachers like Alina Marchenko tried to nurture learning, but many students were too weak or orphaned to attend. Hospitals, overseen by physicians such as Dr. Petro Hlushchenko, faced shortages of medicine and trained staff. The human toll was not just in bodies, but in minds, families, and culture. Outside Ukraine, the story remained largely unspoken. Walter Duranty, despite increasing evidence, continued to obscure the reality. Some journalists, like Gareth Jones, continued to speak the truth, but their voices were small against the machinery of censorship and political convenience. Governments, including those of the United States and Britain, prioritized diplomacy over humanitarian response. Recognition of the tragedy would take decades. Within Ukraine, the trauma influenced culture, politics, and identity. Folk songs were rewritten to speak in metaphors. Stories of vanished relatives passed quietly from parent to child. The famine became a shadow, shaping the collective consciousness. By 1935, new Soviet programs sought to rebuild agriculture, yet the memories of 1932 to 1933 remained. a cautionary scar that no decree could erase. Historical inquiry would take much longer. Scholars like Robert Conquest in later decades would document the Holodomor in detail, piecing together the evidence from archives, eyewitness testimonies, and censored reports. Today, the events are widely recognized, and Ukraine commemorates the victims each year on Holodomor Memorial Day, a solemn reminder of what hunger, wielded deliberately, can inflict. The landscape itself bears witness. Rolling fields, once the stage of famine, now feed millions again. Yet the earth remembers the thousands of hands that dug shallow graves. Rivers carry whispers of those who perished quietly on their banks. Villages rebuilt on old foundations carry the faint echo of lost voices. Even in 1933, some tried to understand what had happened. Lazar Kaganovich and Vyacheslav Molotov, who had executed the policies, considered the events a necessity of statecraft. Meanwhile, ordinary people like Mykola Shevchenko, Ivan Hertsenko, and countless nameless farmers lived with the consequences. Their memories etched into every barren winter and every hidden seed carefully saved for survival. The Holodomor became a silent teacher. It demonstrated the fragility of human life when subjected to political ambition. It illustrated how power, bureaucracy, and ideology could weaponize something as basic as food. And it left an enduring lesson. That memory must endure, so that the world may recognize warning signs before silence becomes death. By December 1933, the famine had technically ended. Seeds had been planted, fields prepared, and surviving families struggled to resume a semblance of normal life. Yet Ukraine, once again, remained quiet, not because peace had returned, but because the echo of hunger demanded silence. A generation had learned to listen carefully to the land, to measure each bite of bread, and to remember in whispers those who were no longer there. In the calm of Ukrainian nights, when the wind brushed over empty fields and frost glimmered on the cold soil, one could almost hear it, the faint echo of lives lost, a ghostly reminder of a past that refused to be forgotten. And though decades would pass, and governments and historians would debate names, numbers, and causes, the people of Ukraine carried the truth in their hearts, that the Holodomor was more than a famine. It was an orchestrated, deliberate tragedy, and its scars remained, quiet, deep, and eternal. If the story of the Holodomor, the tragic famine that struck Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, moved you, there's so much more to uncover. Every chapter reveals the human cost of history, the lives affected, and the lessons we must never forget. By learning about events like these, we honor those who suffered and ensure their stories live on. If you found this video eye-opening, take a moment to like it and share it with others who value history and truth. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly historical documentaries, each crafted in a calm, cinematic storytelling style that makes history come alive. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which chapter impacted you the most, or if you have other historical events you want us to cover. Together, we can explore history, understand humanity, and remember the stories that matter.